Okay, my name is Jim Kinney. I'm the Executive Vice President of Academic Publishing at Baker Publishing Group, and I'm here today to talk with our author, Jeannine Brown, about her new book, The Gospels as Stories, a narrative approach to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Jeannine is Professor of New Testament at Bethel Seminary. And Jeannine, I'm just going to get you to talk about the book as much as we can. So I'm going to start by just letting you talk about narrative criticism. You've been working on that since you did your PhD at Luther Seminary it was the disciples and how Matthew portrayed the disciples, right?
Correct.
So in the book, you start off with a little introduction to narrative criticism. So talk a little bit about why that's a compelling, how did you get into narrative, but then also how has it changed over the decades that you've been working on it?
Absolutely. I found it a very compelling method when I was introduced to it in my doctoral work. I had studied redaction criticism in seminary and learned, of course, about form criticism and source criticism, but had done the redaction criticism and really was drawn to what, for the first time for me, were the whole sweep of the stories of the Gospels. So reading Matthew with an eye toward what is Matthew up to was a new idea for me, even though I grew up in the church forever. The little stories were the thing, right? So it wasn't so much how a gospel writer brought them together. Redaction criticism cared about the evangelists. Right. So I was primed as I moved into doctoral work to hear redaction criticism and go, of course, why aren't we reading these things from beginning to end and thinking of them as essentially storied? They are stories. I do think they're historical, so they're histories, but at its base is this wonderful telling of a story, and none of them are the same. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do them all very distinctly, and this has been one of the, I think, the helpful pieces out of redaction criticism into narrative criticism is that even Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic gospels, those similar ones, do it quite differently. Mm-hmm. And so narrative criticism just made sense to me. And some of the ways I think narrative criticism is a very versatile method. It can bring other methodologies as partners into the task of reading a gospel. Initially, very early on, narrative criticism did this sort of ahistorical reading, just bracket all history. Well, as soon as you come to Luke 3 and you read about tax collectors and soldiers coming to John the Baptist, for baptism and having this interaction, you have to know who those folks are, right? And Luke doesn't say, by the way, the tax collectors are, and by the way, the soldiers that we're talking about are really in. So you have to bring in history. And so historical work to kind of undergird the story reading became really essential fairly early on. I'd say within the first 10 to 15 years, people were saying, no, this has to be part of what we're doing. Intertextuality, the idea of paying attention to how the Old Testament is used in the New, not just in its citations and allusions, but even in its echoes, I think really fits well with narrative criticism, because I think there's a storied way that the New Testament writers use the Old Testament. So in a variety of ways, narrative criticism has been able to keep up with some of the newer approaches. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm gonna follow up with that, because I love the way you laid out the book, in that you've talked about some of these aspects, and you talk about plot, and then you illustrate that throughout the Gospels in that theory chapter, but then you follow up with a chapter that's focused on one of the Gospels. So you do plot, you do characterization, you do intertextuality, and then you do theology, and then each of those is followed up by a Gospel. So talk a little bit about why did you lay it out that way? Maybe if you've gotten some responses from either readers or from students about when you present it that way. So talk a little bit about the layout.
Yeah, I was really intentional in the theory chapters to really illustrate my points all the way through with all of the Gospels. So in the plotting chapter, you'll hear about all the Gospels, and I saved much of the Luke stuff actually for chapter 3, which is the working that out. What does plotting look like in Luke? How does Luke plot the story of Jesus? One thing that practical chapter in each case helped me with was to say, I need to really read a whole gospel here. I mean, I need to give my reader a sense of the whole of Luke from beginning to end. I still had to be selective, but there was a way I couldn't get away from any particular part of Luke that I wasn't quite sure about in terms of plot. I had to press into that. I think I was most aware of that. So characterization, and then Matthew, the next set, intertextuality, then John. I worked with areas there where I had published material to work with, to draw from, and just basically brought it into a very readable, kind of accessible format. In the last pairing of chapters, narrative theology and the Gospel of Mark, I had to do a lot of legwork. Okay. Because I was looking at the character of God, who is, that's not just God's character, but who is God portrayed to be all across Mark's Gospel. I was helped very much by somebody I went through my PhD work with, who did a dissertation, never published on it, on that topic. But I had to really work through the text from beginning to end, because I had to look at every place where God is expressly mentioned or implicitly mentioned, the divine passives, for example. That was just wonderful work to do. And a narrative approach should push you to address that whole gospel in light of that particular lens. So I had to kind of do what I push my students to do, which is address the whole as much as possible.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think that is some of the brilliance of those chapters. Because in any book like this, when you're talking about phenomena in the text, you could just cherry pick your favorite examples, but by forcing you to deal
and that's what I could do in the theory chapters a bit. Yeah. Oh, I think I'll just use this one because I know it,
Yeah.
But it really did. And I've really had probably the most comment from readers on narrative theology. The theory chapter, I wasn't finding a lot of companions for conversation. Beverly Gaventa was great. An article she wrote on Acts. But I wasn't finding a lot of conversation partners. And so then to do the work in the last substantial chapter, people have really appreciated that reading of God and Mark.
Yeah, well, let's stay on theology then and talk a little bit more about that. So which is, you talk about how theology is storied. And, I'm sure you have students or have some readers that'll think, oh, theology, that's propositional statements, but you're insisting that a narrative theologizes in a certain way. So can you talk a little bit about, and I'm trying to think of how you,
that sounds right.
Yeah, I think you say that a story theologizes. So,
yes, I like to use a verb, and other people have done that. Paul theologizes, but how we theologize, if we decided that the best vehicle for telling about this truth is a story, how does theology happen then? It's not just in the explicit statements. And early on, for example, in Christology, what do the Gospels tell us about Jesus? There was a real attention to the titles: Son of God, Son of David, Son of Man, and of course Christ or Messiah. But that was so minimal. That was a good place to start, but it certainly wasn't adequate for understanding what a gospel writer is saying about Jesus. Because what does Jesus say and do? What do other people say and do in relationship to Jesus? How does the narrator flesh out who Jesus is by maybe fulfillment quotations? Matthew 8:17, he took their diseases, he bore their sicknesses. What does that tell us about Jesus? So this idea that you have to follow the storyline and listen to those various cues along the way to hear theology was for me a new thing when I started looking at narrative criticism. I needed to really think through. I looked at how I taught this the last 20 years. And I went back to some of the lectures I have on finding theology in narrative, hearing it. And that's where I really drew much of that chapter for, the theory chapter. So I think it's still a new kind of edge for us when we think about how a story theologizes. I give the example in Matthew 11. We wouldn't recognize Matthew's wisdom Christology, Jesus as wisdom, if we didn't hear it, if we were thinking only what we explicitly hear. Jesus is wisdom. We don't hear that in Matthew. But gospel writers don't tend to give us theology that way. Renewal of creation in John. We won't hear Jesus brings a renewal of creation, but we'll hear it if we're listening to Genesis echoed in John. So we have to attune our ears to listen differently for theology in narrative, as with every genre. Every genre expresses theology differently. We've tended to do a one-size-fits-all, and I think that's unhelpful.
Oh, that's great. That's very helpful. Now, what you just said reminds me. I'm going to skip back to the chapters on character, and I've got it written down here. You start off with a quote from Chekhov, and you say, avoid depicting the hero's state of mind. You ought to try to make it clear from the hero's action. So again, it's, they're not going to get an explicit statement, but you're going to. And so, do you see that happening in the Gospels? And yeah, talk a little bit about
very much so. It's been noted by many folks that in characterization in first century biography or Greco-Roman biography and other comparable kinds of writings from that time period, we just don't get the inner workings of the character much. A little bit here and there, but not this sort of psychology of a character, which I think we love to look for when we go to a film. I can walk out of a movie and say, wasn't the characterization great? It didn't even need to have a plot, That's kind of our era. That's what we like to pay attention to. So I find myself and students kind of going for, Peter must have been thinking this, Jesus was thinking this. When we have to prove that, like you say, from the textual phenomena, we have to be able to show if we can kind of show a motivation. We can sometimes, but often we have what they say and do, and we have to be very cautious about bringing those together in this full-blown psychology of a character. The place it shows up so much is when Peter steps out of the boat in chapter 14 of Matthew. We're with him. We've got his psychology all figured out. And I like to point out that that's not really Matthew's point. I mean, Matthew is really focusing us on Christology there. It's not that there's nothing for discipleship. Right. Of course there is. But we tend to want to really get into the psychology of Peter and then figure out what we're going to do, if we're going to be risky or not, if we're going to get out of the boat or not. We can really go, I think, in the wrong direction. It's not that it's terrible. It's just that we kind of go off course from what the author's doing when we try to get into the heads of characters. There's a lot that they say and do, and what others say and do toward them that really help us understand who they are. Yeah,
and that's the whole narrative approach where you're paying attention to what the author's doing and why, and those kind of things, right?
Right. And characterization is a really I don't know if it's contested. There's a lot of writing on characterization nowadays in narrative in the New Testament, the Gospels and Acts. And it's really a lot of good stuff, but there's kind of a spectrum of how full and round are these characters, to use language from a while back, and how, more are they types. I mean, I sit somewhere in the middle of that. But that is it's an interesting conversation in itself, and that's part of what you get in chapter 4.
Yeah, and the characterization. Yeah, a flat character versus a full round character, right? Yeah, kind of thing. Yeah. So our time is gone fast. So I'm going to ask you about the way you ended the book, because I thought it was kind of fun and refreshing, because a student could read the book and kind of feel like, oh, I've kind of mastered this topic, but instead of mastery, you want us to end with a note of mystery. Can you talk a little bit about why you sort of ended up with that concept of mystery?
Yeah, I mean, part of it comes out of having read who God is across Mark, with the way that story ends and this sort of open-endedness of Mark, and the idea that when we're doing theology, I think we're going to be really careful that we don't we're not too presumptuous about what we find and grab and hold and have. I mean, the scriptures tell us about God but God is beyond words, so kind of letting us really grapple with that reality. But then in my experience, I find the smaller text I'm working with, the easier I can feel that I master it. But 21 chapters of John, as I write, can leave you more breathless and certain. There's this sense of, I sat with John when I was thinking about renewal of creation, which is, I have an article in Catholic Biblical Quarterly from 2010. And I sat with that for a year, that theme, and it ruminated and all the way across the gospel. And there was something powerful about not taking little teeny bits and just chewing on those. And in John's word, feasting on kind of little, but just thinking about what does it mean to really grapple with the whole like that. There's just no way to fully comprehend the whole of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Maybe that's okay. Maybe we keep on pressing for that whole book and say, in the end, I don't understand it all. It doesn't all fit together yet. That's a good place to end sometimes.
Yeah, that's great. That's very wise, and I appreciate that. And I think I do think it's a great book. And yes, in some ways, your students this will set them off on a lifelong journey, hopefully, of being close readers and attending carefully to the text.
I hope so. That is my hope.
Well, the book's off to a great start, I will tell you that. And everything's looking good. So I'm going to close. Thanks, Jeannine, for taking this time, and thanks for writing the book. I think it's a great gift to the church.
Glad to have done so.